You're listening to Upfront. I'm Brian Edwards-Teekert. Now a journey into some women's history at a turning point for the nation as a whole. By the late 1960s, decades of civil rights activism had moved the federal government to start diversifying hiring in the public sector. Trade union jobs in particular had been almost exclusively the province of white men, an arrangement often protected by unions that had been stripped of most of their radical elements by McCarthy-era purges. The consolidation of civil rights law, the rise of the women's movement, and the revival of left radicalism in the 60s made for an explosive challenge to that arrangement. Our next guest was at the center of one of those struggles as one of the first crop of electrical trades trainees at Seattle's public power utility. She's one of the characters featured in the new book, High Voltage Women, Breaking Barriers at Seattle City Light. Megan Cornish, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me here. I really enjoy talking about this fantastic book that's come out.
Well, why don't you start by telling me your story? How did you decide that you wanted to work at the power company?
Well, I was already an activist in Seattle Radical Women, a socialist feminist group. And so I was interested in the idea of working in the trades, but I was also very much interested in helping break the trade open for women generally. And I had also been involved in defending men of color getting into the trades. There was a group in Seattle that fought really hard, including civil disobedience actions and so on, to get men into the trades. I got arrested on behalf of that group. And, the subject naturally then came up. Well, if we support men of color getting into the trades, it was primarily men at that time. There were a few women of color. You should also defend women getting into the trades. And they said, you're right. And so they took a position in support of us.
But you weren't just doing it to make a point. They were actually good jobs.
Oh, they're very good jobs. When we started, we were making $1 an hour less than the lowest level because we were a training position, and it was still $1 an hour more than I was making at my other job. So it was definitely an opportunity to make the kind of wages that women didn't have available to them in those days.
You were brought in by someone the city had hired named Clara Fraser to run this training program. Tell me about her.
Well, she was a longtime radical and labor activist. She'd been thrown out of Boeing after the Boeing strike of 1948 because she was an electrician on the line there. And had gone from job to job under McCarthyism, being driven out of jobs when the FBI would show up at their door. But she had been an activist from way back when. And when the anti-poverty program started, she became an expert on training and finding ways to place affirmative action hires in jobs and training people of color into jobs that they had not had before. So she became an employment expert. And then when the poverty program started being phased out, this job opened up at City Light. She was hired basically in order to create this program for women to get into the electrical trades. And because she was a feminist and a socialist, she knew that one of the main places to find people who would be interested in doing this, because, knowing that it would be a struggle, she went out in the feminist movement and let all the different groups that were in existence at that time know that these jobs were open and encouraged people to join, as well as all kinds of other outreach. to the Black community and the Chicano community, and the Asian American community. But I knew her because she had been a founder of Radical Women, but it was a competitive hiring process. So you had to, we competed against, I think, about 300 women to get the 10 women who got into the program.
What did that first class look like?
Well, there were 2 Black women, one Chicana, one Asian American woman, and the rest were white. One was a very out lesbian. Couple more were not so necessarily flagrant about it, but were gay. A couple of mothers. So it was a mix of working class women interested in making excellent wages, learning a trade, and in the cases of about 6 of us also being feminists who were into helping women as a group get into these jobs.
So how did you go over with the men who were already working for the utility?
Well, that was interesting. I got outed as being a member of Radical Women my first week on the job. I was heading into the service center, and 2 guys waylaid me and said, "We hear you're a radical woman. Are you a feminist?" And so, that was an issue right from the start. But, other women were facing racist taunts and a lot of, certain people coming up and saying, "Well, I don't think you can do the job." Some guys would say, "Well, I don't think you can do the job, but I'm willing to, let you try, give you an opportunity to try." So, and there were all various kinds of testing that went on, on the cruise. I remember with some pride being told, "Oh, well, you're not going to be able to lift this feeder arm," which was a heavier cross arm that goes on the pole, up the hand line to the lineman. Bet you can't do it. So I managed to do it, and that went all the way around the line cruise that one of the women had done it.
Yeah. The union they were part of, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers.
Indeed.
Not terribly accepting of women. The bargaining unit was structured so that the women who did work for the utility and clerical positions were outside of it.
Correct. And I shouldn't say, there were guys who were more open, both men who had known about women being in trades during World War II and knew that it wasn't totally unheard of, and also younger guys who had been, involved more in the youth movement that was going on at the time and were more open. So it was a mixed group. But at the time when the program was first set up, there was a certain positiveness toward the us coming in, because for one thing, Clara Fraser knew that the big thing was we had to go into the union right away. We came after the affirmative action, and I think they were actually called Electrical Trades Trainees too, the men of color who came in under a program that was not as well organized, and a lot of the guys didn't make it through the program because they'd be hired 1 or 2 at a time. Instead of, we came in as a group of 10 who could support each other. But because of the fact that we became union members right away, and Clara involved the crew chiefs who were also in the union in helping to create the training program, it had more support then later on, when management made it clear that they decided we were persona non grata and should be driven out.
How did you wind up on management's bad side? I mean, the training program was a management initiative at first.
Yes, it was. Yes, it was. And
and they knew when they hired Clara Fraser that they were hiring someone with a background in organizing and radical activism.
Totally knew she was a Marxist activist. For one thing, she was too well known to be able to hide it, but secondarily, she wouldn't want to because what would be the point? And they hired her because they knew she was effective at exactly what they wanted to do. But the superintendent of City Light was fairly new, and he was a really dictatorial guy. And this is the 70s when that didn't go over very well. And the month before we were hired, almost the entire workforce walked off the job in protest of the superintendent. And they stayed out for 11 days. And this was at least 600 electrical workers, and then I think 1,000 or so other workers, from engineers to all the clerical workers who were not in any union. And so everybody was up in arms against the superintendent. And when we came on board, they were still having meetings and being a very close group that was fighting the policies at City Light. And one of the first things that the majority of us did was go to an employee meeting in the evening and pledge them our support. And of course, the superintendent went into orbit over that. And he did target us after that.
She got fired.
She got fired, and we got fired. It was first she got removed from being the coordinator of the program, and our training got curtailed, and we went straight out onto the crews. And we worked as trainees for a year, and then got a letter saying, "Congratulations, you have completed the Electrical Trades Trainee program, and we wish you well in your future careers," which we characterized as the "congratulations, you're fired" memo.
So you had the privilege of working for less than regular wages for a year, with the end point of that sacrifice being no job at all.
Being laid off. So we protested and got the period extended for something like 3 months. Some of the women had to leave at that point. And to me, that's an absolute lesson in why women of color get hit from both sides, because one of our main leaders was Daisy Jones, and she had kids, and she couldn't wait to be laid off and not have an income. Mm-hmm. So during that period, she quit. She went to the Metro department and became a bus driver for also excellent wages. And they lost somebody who would have been a big asset to City Light. But anyway, we had filed a discrimination suit months earlier over other things that management had done. And when we were laid off, we added our layoff to that case. And we were quite lucky that it only took us a year to go through the process of winning that case and getting our jobs back. So Clara, on the other hand, she was, her case was separated from ours, and it took her 8 years to get back to City Light. But she also beat City Hall.
Yeah, that was in the courts. I'm curious about the changes that took place at the main union, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, Local 77. Yeah. After that moment of solidarity where the women in this training program came out in solidarity with a wildcat strike.
Yeah.
What kind of shifts did you see on the labor side?
Well, we did have a lot of support in that early period. And then in the year that we were laid off, the union went out on strike. And they did not get the support they should have gotten from the International. They were out for 3 months, actually 98 days. I was just reminding myself looking at the book. And were forced back on the job by the International without having won anything. And in reality, the city was really hurting during the time the electrical workers were on strike.
This is during a major contraction at Boeing, Seattle's major employer at the time.
Well, I think that period had happened, but it was a few years after that when things were recovering. And part of the reason that the electrical workers weren't able to make more headway in their strike is that if something really serious happened, the union forced people to go and work to deal with the emergency instead of saying, we really want to deal with this and that therefore you should settle your strike. But so anyway, the union was forced back to work with, this big loss of not having won anything really out of the strike. And just after that, we won our case, which included a back pay settlement, and came back to work. And people were feeling a little bitter. Boy, you sued and got all this money, and we went without pay for 3 months. And so, people's feelings at the time were impacted by that. And so there were some hard times at first. And 3 of us went into the line worker apprenticeship, but it was a situation where, what was being said by management was, well, these women are taking men's jobs. And here they are.
Line worker means you climb utility poles.
Climb the poles, yes. And City Light was forced to open the apprenticeship to the women who had won the case, but they weren't forced. They were able to say, well, we don't need substation constructors who don't climb the poles. So if you want to be an apprentice, you have to be in the line worker apprenticeship. And that was a tough slog. At the end of the first year of that apprenticeship is when Heidi Durham, really due to the kind of harassment she was getting on the job, fell off a pole at 20 feet and broke her back, and was off work for a long time and had to really fight to stay in the electrical trade. They wanted to shuffle her off into a desk job, a secretarial job. And she said, I haven't gone through everything I've gone through not to be in the trade, so that's not happening. But we had to make quite a fight to get her back in the trade. And during that time, I left the apprenticeship, took a different course within the trade and became a power dispatcher. And the one remaining woman, Terry Bach, made it through the apprenticeship, but it was a long slog for her.
Yeah. How are things different today?
Well, they're somewhat different, and in many ways, they're not different. The attitude of the union as an official body has certainly gotten much more supportive, and the man who is actually the business manager of the City Light unit, or actually the whole local, was one of the people who fought for us in the early days, and was a supporter of Heidi when she was fighting against some in the union, saying, well, the accident happened because you were a woman. And on the other hand, there is, I cannot at all say that there isn't discrimination on the job. And more to the point, because Washington State got rid of affirmative action in 1998, I believe it was, a lot has gone backward. For instance, at City Light, they do no outreach to people of color. They do no outreach to women. And so the numbers who go into these, who enter the trade are very, very low. There are some there. There are some women crew chiefs, some women line workers, and substation constructors. And I don't know about cable splicers. There used to be cable splicers. But so they are there, but they're not in the numbers that they should be at all.
Well, Megan Cornish, I want to thank you so much for coming in to tell your story.
Thank you so much for listening to it, and I hope people are interested in the book High Voltage Women, because it's quite a saga.
Megan Cornish was one of the original Electrical Trades Trainees at Seattle Light and Power when the utility started to implement affirmative action hiring for women. She's one of the people who are featured in the new book High Voltage Women: Breaking Barriers at Seattle City Light.